The game I'm about to show you was played at the Women's Under-26 World Championships. It is kind of a hidden pearl, as it, despite being not 100% perfect, displays many beautiful motifs of the King's Indian pawn storm. It is a reminder for the white player to only enter the pawn storm scenario with very good preparation. In my opinion, it is very pragmatical to avoid the pawn storm altogether, for instance by playing the Bayonet Attack. The underlying rationale for this attitude belongs to the fundamentals of risk management. When the playing field is level, you are free to toss a coin if this suits your mentality. In the King's Indian defense, however, you start with a distinct advantage, which makes you having more to lose than black. Hence, a conservative approach appears more advisable to me. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, that's the King's Indian defense, as you know. e4, d6, knight f3, castles, bishop e2. White goes for the classical main line, which in my opinion is the best approach. It is just the most principled line for white. e5. As you know, c5 is an alternative, or bishop g4, but e5 is considered to be the most serious try for black in this position. Castles, knight c6. Again, black follows the path of the main line. d5, knight e7. This is called the Mar del Plata variation, and this very position serves as a tabir because white has so many options now. The Bayonet Attack, which I'm strongly promoting, would now continue with b4. These are the defining moves of the bayonet. I think that b4 is the best move, but knight e1 is also a very good move for white. The drawback, however, is that it can lead to very sharp positions, as you will see in this game. White really has to know what he is doing, and in this game the white player, which was a female of course, didn't rise to the occasion. Knight e7, black unblocks her f-pawn. Normal move is more frequent than knight e8, which is also playable. Bishop e3, this is, I guess, white's best line here. There's also the alternative setup with bishop on d2, so for instance knight d3, f5, bishop d2, but bishop e3 is a bit more testing. f5, black starts her aggression on the king side. Of course f5, f4 might be a threat here. When the bishop would have to leave this g1, a7 diagonal, but d2 would then be a very passive place, so white has now to provide an escape square for the bishop on f2. Also, of course, stabilizing the squares e4 and g4. g4 is very important later because you will see black will try to push his pawn, his g-pawn to g4, and also will succeed in doing so. This is part of the whole variation, and white playing this line is well aware of that. f4, bishop f2. Well, the move f4 of course deserves a small remark. Black gives up the tension in the center, which is on one hand very committing, because it now leaves white free hand on the queen side. On the other hand, this is a precursor for further aggressions on the king side by black. Black wants to push the g-pawn to g4 and then attack in the g-file most of the time. So bishop f2, g5, there we go. b4, knight f6. Black wants to prepare this advance, so the knight is well placed now on f6. Also, the bishop c8 has a free view again. c5. White is not losing any time here. It's kind of a race, so you should not linger too much. Mostly in these kinds of positions, the player who breaks through first on his or her wing, respective wing, so the queen side of course belongs to white and the king side to black. The player who succeeds to break through first very often wins the game. Knight g6, and because of this race-like situation we are in, I always refer to the toss of a coin. It's maybe a bit exaggerated to use this formula, but I can make my point quite clear. I mean, it's a bit of a gamble because in this position you cannot really calculate the future. It's all too much hidden in the future. It's too obscure. You cannot calculate. So you rely on being quicker than the opponent. This kind of makes you lose control to some degree. Of course, if you are well aware of theory, if you analyze this position in great detail, you gain control by doing that. But who is so well acquainted with theory like professional players are? Many amateurs are not. That's why I advise the amateur player not to engage in this coin flip scenarios. It's always a question of risk management, as I told you already in the introduction. Imagine you are playing a worse player, so you are a clear favorite as white. Then you should refrain from tossing the coin, because if you just play a normal game of chess and you can do this with beginning the game with a2, a3 in the first move, you will normally win. Or let's say you are a 75 favorite to win the game. Then you should not engage in such scenarios. So play any other line, play the Bayonet Attack, because there you don't end up in these kind of scenarios. But of course, if you are well acquainted with theory, if you have a good memory, you can play like this with white. It's not a bad line with white. So now white made a mistake here by taking on d6, which actually appears to be a normal move, as white wants to open the c file normally in this position type. And then, by playing moves like rook c1 and then maybe knight b5, knight c7, attacking the rook, and also giving the knight a chance to enter the heart of black's position, which is a square e6. This is a standard plan. But the fact that I have to attach a question mark to this move already shows you that you cannot navigate by intuition alone, or by, let's say, by knowledge of common routines and patterns, because this plan here is not the best for white. What should white have done? White should have engaged in a different plan. a4 is the best move here. This prepares the next move. So if black plays like in the game, rook f7, which is a bad move here, h5 is better. White now pushes the pawn to c6. And of course, if black now takes on c6, white would get a square on d5 for the knight. The bishop is now threatening to come to the a2 g8 diagonal. And also white has some activity here on the queen side. The a7 pawn is weak. And then let's not forget you have like a pawn majority. So you can push your B pawn, creating a passed pawn on c6. If black does nothing, white will capture on b7, rendering the pawn c7 weak, and also the squares on a6 and c6. So the normal reaction would be to keep the position close by b6, but this doesn't work because now white just plays a5, threatening to take on b6. And why was it important to play a4? Imagine the pawn would still stand here on a2, and white would play a4 now, intending a5. Then black would play a6, and after a6, black is poised to close the position. So if white then plays a5, black can play b5, as the pawn is already on a6. Or likewise, if white plays b5, black would close the position with a5. So a4 is a preparation for this c6 idea, which is very strong for white. So white is slightly better in any case, even after h5. This is the way to go for white. But in the game, white played a normal looking move. C takes d6, c takes d6, rook c1. White wants to penetrate black's position by the c file. Rook f7, overprotecting the square c7. This is a very important motive to play the rook to f7. Not only do you cover the square c7, so after knight b5, you could just push the knight away with a6, right? But you also want to engage the rook in the g file. So the standard plan is to play, let's mark it red because this is more like an aggressive plan. Bishop f8 and then rook to g7, followed by this g4 idea. So the rook has both a defensive and an offensive effect here on the 7th rank. a4, bishop f8, there we go, a5, all theory, but not the best theory for white, as I mentioned before. Bishop d7, and now white committed another mistake by playing the normal looking move knight b5. Better would have been to play king h1 instead, in order to prepare for the kingside attack black is intending to unleash. Okay, knight b5. This has been played in many games, so it's a very normal approach to the game, but it doesn't really work well for white, as we will see. g4, and yeah, that is one reason why you should first play a move like king h1, because as long as the knight still is on c3, overprotecting the e4 pawn, black cannot play g4, as white could simply take it. But now with the pawn e4 being weak, black can just push g4 without a lot of preparation. So this is a very important motive to remember. Now in the game, white took the pawn on a7 with a knight. White played knight a7. But let me first, before we engage in this very exciting game, show you another game, very briefly. So I incorporate another game in my main game here, and the other game is a very famous one. The game Giroud and Piquet against Garry Kasparov. I remember this game very well because when this game was played, 1989 in Tilburg in the Netherlands, this was a very exciting game to watch, and it really gave the King's Indian adherents like me a lot of motivation, to play the kid. So the game picade against Kasparov, who went knight c7, and this is a very normal move because the rook is under attack. If the rook moves away, white would stand clearly better as the knight entered the heart of black's position. And now black is busted on the light squares. White is clearly better here. But Kasparov had prepared this. Kasparov or his team. Well, of course, as you know, he had a very strong team behind him, researching all these sharp positions in great depth. G3 was Kasparov's move. So Kasparov is willing to sacrifice the rook or the exchange on a8. Now, after g3, if white takes a pawn, knight h5, or bishop h6, alternatively, black has enough compensation on the dark squares. You know, we have the bishop coming here. These are typical ideas. Then we have the knight coming here. The rook goes to g7, then the pawn g2 would be soft. You see all of black's pieces spring to life. Of course, the queen has some interesting prospects here on the diagonal, be it h4 or g5. So this is a typical sacrifice here, a standard pawn sacrifice on the king side. So in the game, picade took the rook, which is of course more testing for black, but it turns out to be weak. Now a very strong move occurred. Kasparov didn't take the bishop, he played knight h5. So he didn't just want to take on f2, he wanted to play the queen to h4, using the pawn g3 as a coffin nail. So the queen h4 motive is very well known to King's Indian players. The intention is to give checkmate on h2. As long as the pawn still is on g3, there's a lot of danger present for white's king. So king h1, because queen h4 was a threat. Now after queen h4, the bishop could withdraw to g1. That's the idea of king h1. But now Kasparov takes, or took, he took in that game, played 1989. The rook has to take, and now knight g3 check, using the square because black, of course, wants white to take. White cannot afford to capture the knight, and then another time the pawn would appear on g3, followed by queen h4, queen h1, and then queen h2, and then queen h1, and maybe checkmate depending on the specifics of the position. So this knight is untouchable. King g1, only move. Now Kasparov takes the knight, and now picade should have played b5 here, and after queen d8, the queen comes back, attacking the a pawn, rook a1. This position is slightly better for black. In the game, which was quite short, white played, after queen takes a8, the move bishop to c4. So white now prepares to capture the knight, and then move after f takes g3, moving the rook away, and then if black comes with his queen to h4, white's king can escape via f1 and e2. So the bishop vacated the square f1 for the king. But now comes the strong move, a6. The queen not only has this route here, it also has this very nice diagonal available to it. And actually black is already winning here. Black not only has a slight material advantage, what is more important is his positional advantage on the dark squares. The knight is untouchable here. Black cannot take the knight because then the king would really be in a lot of trouble. after HCFG, queen d8, queen h4, because don't forget, if the f pawn is moving to g3 after HCF3, the knight can take its place and the king cannot be evacuated via f1 e2. The knight f4 would cover this escape square, so this queen d8, queen h4 plan would be lethal. Queen d3 happened, queen a7, and now if white would pass the right to move to black, black would continue with bishop e7 and then bishop h4. Afterwards, black can move this knight away, attacking the rook on f2. b5 happened the game, but after ab, bishop b5, now the game only lasts one more move. If you want to find the move yourself, you can press on the stop button right now and try to find black's last move here, after which Piquet resigned. Okay, the move was knight h1. Beautiful way to attack the rook. After that, black will have an extra piece, so resigning was the best Piquet could do. Yeah, that went very bad. That went very badly for Piquet, but I also want to remember there was once a game Piquet-Kasparov which went 1-0. So Piquet actually did beat Kasparov in a very famous game. Okay, let's go back to our position. g4, knight takes a7 instead of knight c7 as we just saw in the game. g3, bishop b6. So, of course, now white cannot take twice on g3 as the bishop must keep defending the knight, right? This was not an option to take 2 times on g3, but bishop b6 solves the problem. After the a7 pawn has vanished, the b6 square is now available to white's bishop. Now black committed a mistake. After queen e8, the position is unclear. Yeah? The engine gives equality, but of course it's quite messy, so unclear I think is the right comment here. Queen e7 happened in the game, and now white should have played bishop b5 with a slight advantage in a very unclear position. Having a slight advantage in such a messy position is not the same as having a slight advantage in a clear-cut position. If the position is very easy to play, having a slight advantage very often means that you play for 2 results. So you play for a win or a draw, excluding the loss. But of course, in this position, everything can happen despite white's slight advantage. But instead of bishop takes or bishop moving to b5, white played knight to b5, which also is a very logical move because the knight on a7 is a bit out of place, and who knows, sometimes maybe could be taken by the rook. At least on a7 the knight is binding the bishop b6. So moving it back and maybe also intending to activate it via c7, e6, it's a very logical move. So we cannot really blame the white player too much. Even though, I mean, the logic behind bishop b5 is also clear if you are a bit more acquainted with the underlying concepts here. Because one thing here in this position is that white sometimes can play h3, but only if black is unable to sacrifice the bishop on h3 in one way or the other. So exchanging that d7 bishop adds to white's defensive resources. Hence, this bishop b5 move is very logical for the initiated. But you have to really understand this position very deeply in order to come to that conclusion. So knight e5 is also not very unlogical because, as I mentioned, this idea is looking very strong. But now it's black's turn to move. knight h5 comes, and now queen h4 is a very strong threat. Queen h4, h3, bishop takes h3. That would be winning. You cannot play now h3 because after queen h4 there is no defense against bishop h3. White simply has not enough space to organize a defense here on the king side. You can check it yourself with your engine. So king h1 came here in the game, and now actually taking on h2 would have been best. The engine gives a winning position, a winning advantage for black. So now queen h4 happened, not the best move, but a very logical move, normal move in this position. Bishop g1, only move, because h3, bishop h3, as I mentioned before, doesn't work. And now black should have taken on h2. So the best line for black would have been g takes h2, bishop f2, queen g5. And this position can be considered clearly better for black. It's not completely easy for black to break through, but you can see that white's king is incarcerated, and every ending is very bad for white because he cannot play with his king. And of course the first ring is a bit of a problem. But the fact that white is not playing with his king really deserves this verdict that black is clearly better here. Now, what happened in the game? The game, black played a logical move which turned out to be bad according to the engine, but it is really difficult to calculate all this over the board. This move, rook f6, is also not unlogical, so both players played a fairly decent game so far. They played logical moves, but the position is so complicated that sometimes logical moves end up being mistakes. Now white should have played queen d2. So I don't want to go too much into detail. This is the best defensive move, and after that the position would have been unclear. The queen is taking care of two squares here which are relevant, f2 and g2. I will show you lines in a bit which demonstrate that both squares are very, very relevant, and the queen now is on the second rank, and if the bishop moves away later, the queen controls these important squares. This position is unclear. Another move would have been bishop d3, also with the idea to build up a defense along the second rank, but this is not as good, because after g takes h2, bishop f2, queen g5, knight c3, knight h4, you see g2 is under attack. The rook can join in, and later also the other rook, just have these moves in mind. So there can be a lot of pressure along the g file. That's why I was telling you that g2 is an issue. So here white has to take the knight. Of course now there's a threat of mate in 1, knight g3 check, knight e2. This is why the knight had to come, all the way from b5 in order now to cover this square. But after rook g6, and as indicated, black has some ways to attack the g2 pawn. Bishop e7, king h8, rook g1, and then bishop h3 finally. Because also the square g1 would be a problem after g takes h3. So what happened in the game? Knight c7, a very logical move, attacking the rook and also intending to play the bishop to, the knight to e6. This would then exchange this d7 bishop, or would at least prevent it from playing some bigger part on the king side. So with the knight on e6, white could then play h3, as the bishop cannot capture there anymore. The knight is sealing that c8, h3 diagonal. So a very logical move, but a losing move. Now knight e7 happens. This is a very strong move. Black lets her rook hang on a8. And actually, if you play the King's Indian, you have to play in this spirit. You cannot play too materialistically. You have to play dynamically. So the black player is a genuine King's Indian player. She makes most of this position. That's a very beautiful move. In the game, white took the rook. But before we will have a look at that, let's see what happens after some alternatives. One would be bishop b5 instead of knight takes a8. Bishop b5, intending to exchange one attacker, the bishop d7. But black is to move. G takes h2, bishop takes, rook h6. That was the idea of playing the rook to f6, and then, of course, of playing knight e7, vacating the 6th rank for the rook. King g1, and now white is lost because black can win in style by sacrificing the queen. This position is full of very, very beautiful motifs, and now is the time where I will show you all of them, one by one. So this is first, you know. So if the king moves away, black is just winning material. The king cannot move to the queen side as the rook f1 would be hanging. This is winning very banally. So after king takes queen, we have a beautiful checkmate on the square f1. So the rook, let's just show you what the rook did. The rook went first to f7 and then decided to go to the 6th rank, and finally came all the way around to mate the king, let's say, from behind. Beautiful. Now, after knight e7, this beautiful winning move, white can also play knight d3, covering this f2 square. But now the problem is the square f2 is covered well. That is true, and this is relevant in the game, as you will see. This one is covered now, but the square g2 is now the problem. And now bishop h3 is finishing white off. I will give you some lines here. Let's say the bishop is taken. Now we have this magnet sacrifice, so giving a tempo to the rook here, check, threatening checkmate, and after rook f2, the other checkmate is coming to fruition. So there was a double threat, right? Queen g2 and knight g3. So typical King's Indian patterns, right? Nothing new for the King's Indian player. So the bishop cannot be taken. What else can white do? White could play, let's say white takes the rook. Now the bishop comes to g2, takes, and you see again g2 is a problem, and if you defend against this threat, knight g3, takes, now queen takes h2, checkmate is a threat. If the queen defends, there's mate in 2. Queen takes g2, queen g2, checkmate. So after bishop h3, the knight has to return actually to e1 in order to meet this threat of bishop takes g2. Now the rook goes to the h file. It's not only this square which is the problem, or this square which we will happen to see in the game, but also this square h2, the h file. Let's say bishop b5 in order to vacate the 2nd rank, so white could maybe defend on the 2nd rank, or maybe in some variation white's king could escape because now the square e2 is vacated. G takes h2. If now bishop f2, we see something very similar to the game. Queen f2. I will refer to the end of the game, right? I don't want to spoil it by showing you the full variation. So let's say bishop takes h2, bishop c8. Of course, now knight to g3 is a problem. Bishop rook b8. There's no need for black to play too fast because white cannot defend against black's midterm idea. The idea is to play knight to g3, and this knight cannot be taken because after bishop takes g3, fg3, there would be mate on h1, right? But after knight g3, the next move would be knight h1, and that's a beautiful motive. Imagine the knight here. Of course, black can play knight, queen takes h2, king f2, queen h4, which is not very nice for white. But in this position, black would not take on h2. Black would play this. This would be his next move, and there is no defense against queen takes h2, checkmate. This is a very beautiful motive. Not taking on h2 here, but playing knight to h1 in order to take away the escape square f2 for white's king. So now let's see how the game finished. White took the rook, g takes h2, threatening checkmate by knight g3, of course. Now there are two moves, bishop f2, which was the game, and bishop takes h2. Let's first have a look at the line, bishop takes h2. Now we have knight g3, king g1, rook h3, and now, for instance, if bishop g4, again, as I have shown you before, this beautiful motive, giving checkmate outright on h2. So if now white, instead of playing bishop c4, plays knight d3, now black plays knight c6. Black is in no rush because white's king cannot escape. So if white's king tries to escape here, black would simply play knight takes e4, check, and after king g1, then we would have queen h2 checkmate. So this move is not possible. And if you would be asked which piece here will be dealing the decisive blow, it is the most innocuous one. Actually, it is the bishop on f8. You might think that this bishop is really the lazy piece here and not having any impact on white's position, but this is false because this bishop will give checkmate in this position here to white's king. Let's say knight b6. There is not so much white can do. On the king side, white is very much paralyzed. So now the knight comes back and tries to influence the game now by attacking the bishop. Bishop e7. And now we see the bishop is coming into play. After knight takes d7, check, queen has to take. This is already checkmate. Beautiful checkmate coming from the most innocuous piece, the bishop f8. Beautiful. So this means that bishop takes h2 simply didn't work. In the game, white played bishop f2. And now comes a beautiful finish, queen to f2. White resigned in view of the following line. Queen is taken by rook f2. Now we have this fine finish, knight g3, king h2, check, check, and now rook h1 yet another different final mate pattern. We already had the mate pattern on f1 with the rook and the king on f2. We had the mate pattern with the knight on h1 and then queen takes h2 checkmate. We had so many different patterns. I hope you enjoyed the show. So the King's Indian really is a lot of fun. Too bad for the kid player that there are some lines which prevent black from attacking in this beautiful style, like the Bayonet Attack or others. And yeah, sometimes life is just not fair. But if you should happen to play a game like this with black, congratulations. This is where the King's Indian players really thrive and where they really enjoy themselves, definitely.